In this video, you will discover 5 common mistakes killing your podcast retention time and how to increase the engagement on your show for faster podcast growth. So look, my name is Anthony Maneri. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListens.com, a company helping entrepreneurs of podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm now, of course, the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generates around $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month. Those books down there, Daniel Larson, those are also books that we've co-authored as well. But look, this isn't about me, it's about you. So let's dive straight in. So look, here's the thing. Many podcasters think that getting just tons of reviews, focus on podcast SEO to be discovered, promoting on social media, because apparently social media promotion is the best way to grow your podcast, or it's something we should absolutely must do if we want to grow and get high profile guests, because, well, if we get high profile guests on our podcast, they will share it with their audience and their audience will then discover our show. Doing all these different things, hoping that's going to lead to faster growth. But here's the thing. If you had bad engagement on your show and you can't keep listeners' attention and you can't get those same listeners to come back for more, how on earth are you going to grow your podcast consistently month after month? And how the hell are you going to make podcasts from a show that can't keep listeners engaged? And the truth being told, a lot of podcasts out there just don't know how to keep their attention and have high engagement rates with their audience. Imagine your favorite TV show. You're constantly hooked from the first scene and you can't wait to see what happens next. That's the kind of engagement you want for your podcast. That's the type of engagement your podcast needs in order to attract, engage, and more importantly, retain, meaning getting those same listeners coming back for more. We're talking about creating content your listeners can't pause, but they're eagerly waiting for each episode. Creating genuinely binge-worthy content, Netflix-style series, binge-worthy content. That's what we want for your podcast in order to keep your listeners at the edge of their seats and coming back for more. But look, what's the outcome of this? Well, number one, you get high retention, which means you get creating engaging content that actually has listeners tuning in for the whole episode. This signals a positive message to Apple and Spotify. Those are the main platforms listeners are on. It signals a great message saying, hey, by the way, this podcast is really good. It's keeping users on our platform. Let's recommend it to more people. So when you're trying to rank high on Apple and Spotify through podcast SEO, this is going to help you massively. It also means that when you're promoting, let's say on social media and someone comes in, they're far more likely to stay a listener if they've engaged highly with one specific episode. Because if they come in, the episode's crap, you can't keep their attention, and they leave, why the hell would they come back for future episodes? They just wouldn't, right? And then other pieces, it helps when it comes to monetization. So the higher your engagement rate, the better it is for sponsors and partnerships. But honestly, again, I don't recommend sponsors or partnerships. I tend to put this on here because it seems to be something that every podcaster wants to do. But we recommend, if you're an entrepreneur with a podcast, with your own program or offer, we highly recommend you just share your own stuff, sell your own stuff. But if you have a low engagement rate, it doesn't matter whether it's your own stuff or someone else's stuff, sponsors, ads. If you can't keep listeners engaged and if your listeners don't feel like they've gotten enough value from your show, why the hell would they buy from you or an affiliate or a sponsor? They just won't, right? So this is so key. So look, here are the top 5 mistakes you should make if you want low engagement on your podcast. Number 1, go crazy with your fluffs and tangents. Going off on way too many tangents and talking about irrelevant topics that don't deliver on the promise or value to your listeners directly. This will cause new listeners will lose interest. And I know that a lot of people think that going off tangents or fluff or just talking about random topics with an episode itself when there's a longer form content helps because it feels more natural. It lets it feel a lot more smooth. Here's the thing. Tangents, when they're relevant, aren't too bad, but it's going on way too many when you lose focus of the actual episode. If you think about it, even when you listen to Joe Rogan or The Diary of a CEO, it's such focused content. You don't hear like Stephen Bartlett going on random tangents that don't really make any sense. No, it's focused content. So again, a mistake that you should make if you want to just have low engagement is just talk about a bunch of fluffy stuff and go on massive tangents without keeping the focused on actual episode title. Number 2, have random titles. Now, this one sounds a bit weird, like how would titles of my episode affect the engagement? But here's the thing, using vague and unclear episode titles that don't clearly convey what the podcast is about or what listeners will gain in an episode leads to essentially kind of unmet expectations, right? Because if you have a title that says one thing, but your episode delivers something else, people just click off because they're not getting what they came for. And again, this kind of goes into this piece here, going on like fluffy and random tangents. Because if you have an episode title that is specific, but then you've spent way too long on this random tangent or story that's not really relevant for your audience or what they came for, new listeners don't know you, they don't care, they'll stop, they'll click off. People are ruthless, right? So it's so important that once again, we deliver on the value of our titles by keeping the episode focused or the conversation super focused on what's promised within the title. The third thing, having long intros. Now, this one is a pet peeve of mine. I'm just going to just say it straight up. When you have just like way too long backstories or advertisements or Patreons, guess what? A new listener just discovered your podcast and they're being hit with a backstory about this thing and about backstory about that thing. Or when you give super long intros to your guests and then you talk about their credentials, all these different things, and all it does is prolong your intro, make it super long and drawn out to the point where people's attentions are basically lost, right? Again, we're trying to optimize a show for new listeners. Your current listeners don't mind. They know you guys, they build that rapport, they care. I get that. But we're trying to optimize for new listeners, trying to attract, engage, and retain those new listeners. So when you have super long intros, it gets a bit boring and again, loses people's interest. Number 4, bad audio quality. I'm going to keep this on short and sweet. Honestly, if your audio quality isn't 100%, if it's not crisp, if it's not good as a podcast, what are we doing here, right? So important that you constantly, so important that maybe every 6 months you evaluate, look at your audio quality, get some fresh ears to listen to your show and just give you the honest take of the podcast, whether that's your audio or your guest audio. And if you do struggle with bad audio quality, or maybe audio quality that isn't 100%, or maybe you get amazing guests on, but your guests themselves have terrible audio quality, sometimes you can't help that. I'll recommend the platform called Descript. It has a feature called Studio Sound that literally like cleans up the audio with AI and it makes it sound super, super crisp. And a 5th thing, having poor pacing and having the content where it's not just super consistent. So when you have inconsistent pacing and the inability to draw out the best content from your guest or yourself, it leads to slow retention time, it leads to low engagement because your pacing is way off or way too slow. And people, again, nowadays, like, they have TikTok brains, right? That's the honest truth. But, you know, even people who are listening to Stephen Ballard or all these other high quality shows, they're used to the pacing being on point and they're used to things moving quickly, not necessarily quickly, but again, the pacing feels nice. You're going into the right pain points with your guests. You're really unraveling a story and then you're moving swiftly onto the next thing, or you're fully exploring that story and then you're moving on to the next thing. So really thinking about the pacing, because it plays a huge role on keeping your audience's attention. So now, what should you do instead? So firstly, stick to your episode's promise. If your title promises tips on podcast growth, dive straight into podcast growth. Number 2, ensure your titles are specific and hint at the values listeners will gain. This is an easy one that you can do. Just honestly, whenever you find yourself, going on a tangent or maybe going in a different pocket that you weren't expecting, just remind yourself, what's the focus of this conversation? And constantly center yourself there. I believe Stephen Ballard actually uses this with his guests. He has a specific word he gives his guests at the start of the episode, and that's the word that they focus on, or to keep themselves centered and focused. And that intentionality allows your conversation to have a specific flow, to have a specific direction, and it means that as a listener, it creates such a good listener experience for your listeners, for your audience. And what will they do? They'll come back for more when you do this. Number 3, start with a powerful question or promise that grabs your audience's attention. So whether that's a video or a podcast, just start by stating, hey, by the end of this episode, you will discover, and then tell them what they're going to discover. You will discover 5 growth murder mistakes that are hurting your engagement rate, whatever it might be for you, right? And it's going to be so important. By giving a promise or posing a question, you're essentially saying, hey, stick around because you're going to gain this one thing, right? So having a strong hook primes your audience to know what they're going to gain from the episode. It gives them and incentivizes them to listen, especially if they're new. Number 4, stay on topic and avoid unnecessary tangent. I've kind of made this point already, so I'm going to make this point one last time. Just stay focused for the entirety of your podcast. Post-edit, you can simply cut out any bits that are fluff, that doesn't quite make sense, or that are tangents that don't really add to your audience, or inside jokes that, again, don't really add to your audience. Number 5, keep your intros short and sweet. The shorter your intros, the better it will be for you. I promise you, having long, drawn-out intros, and I get why you might want to introduce your guests and talk about their credentials and talk about their backstories and to give context. But again, you can just simply shorten your episode by stating specific things your audience will gain from the episode, rather than going on long tangents about the backstory of your guests. Because for new listeners, they're just thinking, well, what's in this for me? So the faster you can let them know what's in it for them, the better it is. And I think your intros can really be maximum 1 minute to 1.5 minutes at max. So 60 seconds to 90 seconds max. And then you get straight into the episode. Having things that are way too long, you just lose people's interest. And I want to just show you an actual practical example of why this is so powerful. This is a past client of ours called Jane, and her retention time was around an average 40%. So that's the retention time. You can find it on Apple Podcasts Connect, or you can just go on Spotify for podcasts. You can have a look at your retention time. It's essentially the completion rate on average for your episodes. So for her, it was like 40, 50%, and we boosted it up to 90% by simply shorten an episode, keeping her episodes way more on topic, having super specific episode titles, and making sure there was no fluff within that, right? Not going off on too many tangents. And for her, the intro piece made a huge difference. You can see literally so many people dropped off an intro because it was long, drawn out, massive backstory, didn't really make any sense. But once we fixed this, guess what? Her engagement rate increased. Why? Well, because listeners were engaged throughout the entire episode, they gained a ton of value, and then they come back for more, and then they share it more because it's a good episode that they actually enjoyed and listened all the way through. But if they have a low engagement rate, why would they share it with a friend or their social media, or why would they come back for more? They just won't. So this is so important because this will directly feed into your podcast growth. So look, if you're making any one of those mistakes, I hope this has shed some light. I hope this gave you some new insights on changes you can start making to your podcast in order to increase engagement on your show and to drive faster growth. Look, my name is Anthony Neri. You've been absolutely fantastic. I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.